Okay, folks, thank you for coming today. So we just have one more topic before your final exam, which we've planned to go ahead and give you guys the day before Thanksgiving break. So it's looking like that's next Thursday. And just as a quick reminder, your final exam is just going to cover I guess it's the last 4 chapters from your ManQ textbook, and then obviously what we've talked about in class. So I think that the first topic was the labor market and unemployment, and then we did a couple of sections on the monetary system, right? And then this last topic on open economy concepts. So your final exam is just going to cover those 4 sections, and it'll be the same setup as your first 2 midterms. So expect like 15 multiple choice questions, maybe 1 extra credit question thrown in there, maybe some true false or some type of identification type problem, and then maybe a couple of short answer questions, free response questions that will test your understanding of the various economic models that we've talked about, okay? So we've looked at models of the labor market to think about structural unemployment. We've looked at the quantity theory of money, right? And then later on, actually next week, we'll discuss a particular model of the open economy that will help us understand what determines exchange rates in the long run. But more on that next week, okay? So being familiar with those models and being able to answer questions in the context of them would be kind of what you would be expected to be tested on next Thursday. And then after that, there's no more class, and I'm not going to give you guys a regular final exam during finals week. Try to get everything done before we go fully online. Okay, so are there any questions about that before we get started today? Oh, and one other thing. So there will be 1 more extra credit opportunity. I'm going to go back to the office tonight to do some other things, but I'll send another email out to the whole class, and it will be another outside of class exercise. If this were a normal semester, which of course it is not, it's an activity an exercise that we would have done in groups in class, but I'll just have to give you this assignment for you guys to do on your own. And then you can submit it before next Thursday, and I'll look at it for extra credit. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and get started then. Up until this final point in the semester, our journey through some basic topics in macroeconomics, we've basically ignored the effects of interactions with other economies around the world. If you really think about it, when we talked about stuff like long-run economic growth, the financial system, labor markets and unemployment, as well as the monetary system, in each of those discussions, we basically disregarded issues arising from the fact that we participate in an open economy. In other words, or I guess the reason why we've done that would be that ignoring the fact that we actually do interact with the rest of the world helps simplify what we're trying to do, okay? It helps us simplify the issues and helps our understanding of these various topics like growth or unemployment or the monetary system. That's a virtue. A lot of times that's a good thing. If we can simplify the complex world around us and really get to the issue at heart, it's going to help our understanding. But there are times, I would say, that ignoring the fact that we actually do interact with the rest of the world in global markets can sometimes be very misleading and create or lead to maybe erroneous conclusions, all right? And so that's what we want to try to start to rectify today. Now, if you think about it, every one of us participates in international markets, whether you actively kind of realize it or not, right? Most of or a lot of the clothing that we wear on a day-to-day basis, a lot of that stuff is manufactured in places like East Asia, okay? If you guys eat fresh fruits and vegetables during the winter months, That stuff's not grown in Alabama, right? It's probably grown in Central America or maybe even South America and shipped into the United States. Modern electronic products are manufactured in places like South Korea, China, maybe even Japan. Okay, so a lot of the basic goods and services that we consume and that we acquire on a daily basis were actually produced abroad. And so we are constantly engaging in these types of international markets. They're very, very important to our everyday lives. We're going to begin this last section of the course by discussing some of the key macroeconomic variables that describe activity in these global markets. Some of them you've heard of before, and some of them may be new to you, okay? So for example, things like exports and imports, these are familiar to you. We're gonna talk about them in a little bit more detail today. A concept known as the trade balance and how that relates to trade deficits versus surpluses. This may be something that you're not too familiar with. International flows of goods and services across borders, as well as international flows of capital assets. We will talk about the prices of these international transactions probably next week, and we refer to those as exchange rates. All right? What do all of these macroeconomic variables mean? And more importantly, how are they related to one another? We're going to start answering some of those questions today. That's step number one. The second goal of this last section of the course is that I want to try to actually build a theory, a coherent kind of economic model that helps us explain what determines exchange rates in the long run. Okay? Now, that model is not too complicated. Like a lot of the other models that we've talked about, it is built on basic supply and demand principles. Okay? The particular model of exchange rates has kind of a complicated name. It's what's known as purchasing power parity, or PPP for short. All right? Now, that sounds complicated, but at its core, that particular model is just a supply and demand application to goods that are sold in international markets and will help us understand what drives exchange rates in the long run. Why did we develop the loanable funds market? To help us understand what drives the real interest rate over time. Why did we develop the quantity theory of money? To help us understand the relationships between the money supply or money growth and prices and inflation. All right. The point of developing the theory of purchasing power parity is to help us understand what is it that's causing exchange rates to move over time in the way that we observe. We'll do that, develop that model fully next Tuesday. Okay? All right, any questions then about kind of where we're going here? All right, the first point that I think principal students need to understand is that an open economy can interact with other countries around the world really in two ways, okay? One way is by buying and selling goods and services in global product markets, all right? But there's a second way that countries can interact with one another, and that is by buying and selling capital assets in global financial markets, okay? One of the essential objectives of this last section of the course, maybe the most important objective then, is to understand how these two particular activities are related to one another. Are these global product markets completely distinct from global financial markets? Are they independent from one another? Or are the flows of goods and services in product markets somehow related to the flows of assets in these financial markets? More on that in a minute, but I can tell you that the answer is the latter. They're going to be related to one another in a pretty important way. Let's start by discussing the easier of the two, the one that you're probably more familiar with, and that is these global product markets, right? Which tell us how goods and services are flowing across nations' borders, all right? Let's just start by reviewing some basic concepts. First, we have exports. What are exports? These are domestically produced goods and services that are sold in foreign markets or to foreign consumers, okay? Imports are the opposite. These are foreign produced goods and services sold in domestic markets or to domestic consumers, we should say. A country's net exports, given by the variable NX in our economic model, is the market value of a country's exports minus the market value of its imports, okay? So a couple of quick examples here, just to make sure we all understand how these things are related. Let's suppose that the Fender Guitar Company, a US company, sells a bunch of electric guitars to a heavy metal band in the UK, in Britain. How does that affect US net exports? US net exports go up or down as a result of that? They go up, right? And why is that? Because that counts as an export for the United States, but it is an import for the UK. So US net exports would rise, but British net exports would actually fall in that case. Good. Two, what if the Lego Corporation, based out of Denmark, I think, sells these toy bricks to American kids? How does that affect US net exports? They go up or go down? Why? It goes down because that counts as an import for the United States, right? Denmark's net exports would rise by contrast. Okay, good. So you guys understand that. A lot of times, and I'll get back to this more in a minute, but a lot of times you're going to see net exports referred to as the trade balance. So among economists, we always talk about net exports as this difference between a country's exports and imports. But if you read the financial press, or if you see anything in the news about the economy, they might be referencing something called the trade balance. Just know that those two things mean the same. All right, a country's net exports is the same as what we mean by as the trade balance. They're synonymous with one another. And I'll get back to the trade balance here in just a minute. But before I do that, let's go through one of these learning exercises together, because this particular one illustrates an important point, and that is that net exports in a country can be affected not just by events that happen in our own country, but by certain events that happen in foreign countries as well that we might engage in trade with. That's important to understand, is that our own net exports aren't just impacted by things that we do, but can be affected by decisions that are made outside of our borders. All right, let's go through these particular exercises here. I want you guys to tell me what would happen to US net exports in each case, and tell me why. So is it something that affects our exports, our imports, or possibly both? What if there is a recession in Canada, one of our leading trading partners, and as a result, incomes and employment are falling in Canada? What do you think might happen to US net exports as a result of that? Sean? Why? That's right. If incomes in Canada are falling, Canadians are probably going to purchase fewer of all normal goods and services, including the ones that are produced in the US. So our exports to Canada would take a hit, right? And if nothing changes to our imports, then that means US net exports would fall as a result. So an economic shock experienced in Canada can spill over into the United States because we trade with them, all right? So this is an example where ignoring international trade can generate misleading results, right? How about B, US consumers decide to be patriotic and buy more products made in the USA. How does that affect U.S. net exports? Wyatt? Yeah, so all of a sudden we would decide to purchase more products made in the USA. Our imports from the rest of the world would decline. And if there's no change in our exports, then US net exports would go up. So here is an example where US net exports can go up by virtue of less international trade taking place, simply by refusing to purchase goods that are made abroad. Very good. All right, how about the last one here? Prices of Mexican goods rise faster than prices of US goods. How might that affect US net exports? Prices of Mexican goods rise faster than prices of US goods. Matt? No, doesn't have to. Because even if there starts to be a change in prices, that might. So if prices in Mexico start to rise, then prices relative to the US are going to go up. And so that on the margin, then that would probably cause residents of Mexico to want to purchase fewer of their own goods and more US goods. So our exports to Mexico would start to increase as a result of that. But there's more to this story. Wyatt? That's correct, right? So now what we're witnessing here is that US goods are becoming cheaper relative to Mexican goods on the margin. And so that would probably reduce our imports from Mexico. And so in this case, US net exports would rise, but along both margins, because we are exporting more to Mexico, but also because we are importing less from Mexico, right? Another example of where something that causes, let's say, inflation in another country, like growth in the Mexican money supply from their central bank, might have an effect on US net exports, since we are such a heavy trading partner with Mexico. All right, now let me get back to this equivalency between net exports and the trade balance for just a few moments here. You'll recall that net exports basically measure a country's imbalance between its trade in goods and services. This imbalance between the value of its exports and the value of its imports. If you think about it, there's really only three possible states of a country's trade balance then, right? One can be a trade deficit. Now, when does this happen? This happens when our imports exceed our exports, right? If we are buying more stuff from the rest of the world than the rest of the world is buying from us in terms of goods and services, then imports are greater than exports, which means that net exports will be negative, right? And that means that we're going to be running a trade deficit. So when you hear about the big trade deficit in the news, what that means is a negative value for net exports, because the total value of our imports exceeds the total market value of our exports. Another obvious state of the trade balance would be a trade surplus. This is the exact opposite. This is when a country has the value of its exports are greater than the value of its imports. It is selling more goods and services abroad than the rest of the world is buying from it, okay? The United States is a great example of a country that has a trade deficit, and we've had a trade deficit for many years, actually a few decades at this point. China is an example of a country that normally runs rather large trade surpluses. The last possible state of the trade balance, of course, would be if exports exactly equaled imports. That is, net exports is equal to zero, and we would say in that case, the country is running balanced trade. No trade deficit or no trade surplus at all. Okay, you guys understand that? So positive net exports means a trade surplus. Negative net exports means a trade deficit. Net exports equal to 0 means balanced trade. Let me show you some actual US data so that you can kind of get an appreciation for how important international trade has become to the US economy over the years. So this is some raw data on US exports and imports as a percentage of GDP. So the blue line shows the value of our country's exports relative to GDP from 1960 through 2019. The red line shows the value of our total imports relative to GDP. Let's go back in time to, let's say, the early 1960s, and you see that exports and imports were only about 4 or 5% of total US gross domestic product, okay? And in fact, during the 60s, exports exceeded our imports. So we were running fairly small but stable trade surpluses, right? We had positive net exports. Something happened, though, in about the mid-1970s, and international trade with the rest of the world kind of just took off, right? And both exports and imports as a share of GDP have risen over time, and at least according to the most recent data, it looks like they peaked for the United States in and around the time of the previous recession. So maybe 2010, 2012, something like that. And the other thing that we notice here is that the value of our imports has risen over time a little bit quicker than the value of our exports. And so we've been running trade deficits ever since really the mid 70s, right? We've had these brief periods where we've run almost balanced trade, like in the early 80s and maybe the early 90s. But we certainly had these episodes where the trade deficit was kind of ballooning, right? Whereas the imports were growing faster than our exports, okay? Do you guys know who are, and so by the way, today, exports and imports are, around 15% of total GDP. So it constitutes a much larger share of our gross domestic product than it used to. International trade is much more important to our overall economic activity than it was several decades ago. Do you guys know what our leading trading partners are? This is not in the slides, and I don't think I'm going to test you on this, but since we're talking about international trade and the open economy, I think it might be worth knowing who we actually trade with most often. Matt? China is actually number 2 on the list. Our number 1 trading partner is the country right to the north, right? Canada. This is our leading trading partner. China's number 2. I believe Mexico is number 3, followed by Japan, Germany, and the UK. We do trade with OPEC countries. Obviously, we import oil, but it turns out that the US actually produces a lot of that on its own now. And that's just one particular type of product. We trade with all kinds of goods and services with Canada and Mexico and Japan, et cetera. So those are our 5 or 6 leading trading partners. Before I go on to the next slide, let me ask you guys this. I want you to think about some things that might be responsible for this increase in international trade over time. There's obviously a lot of things that could be attributed to this rise in trade among countries. But do you think certain government policies might be at least partially responsible for this increased trade? Sean? Yeah, so certainly as more countries adopted maybe capitalism, it opened up those markets to the United States, to other Western countries. What about this idea of trade barriers? Do you guys know what a trade barrier is? When economists talk about a trade barrier that is erected by a government, what would be an example of that, Matt? Yeah, something like a tariff or a quota. Now, do you guys know what a tariff is? So this is a tax on products that are imported from abroad and sold in domestic markets. What's the point of a tariff? The point of a tariff as a trade barrier is to try to protect domestic industries. It makes foreign products artificially more expensive, which encourages you guys to want to substitute towards the products that are made in the USA that might be a little bit cheaper then, okay? That's different than an import quota. A quota is a firm kind of restriction, a limit on the amount of foreign goods that we can import. But it has the same effect as a tariff in the sense that if you restrict the supply of a foreign product, that's going to raise its price and cause people, domestic consumers, to substitute towards domestically produced products. Over the last several decades, it turns out that the United States and many more developed countries have gradually torn down these trade barriers. We've reduced tariffs. We've eliminated tariffs completely for certain countries. We've reduced or eliminated these import quotas. And that's probably at least some of the reason why international trade between the United States and the rest of the world has increased as well. So, I don't have that in the slides, but just make a mental note or a note on the margins of the slides that you might need to know, kind of at least understand what a tariff is or an import quota, and that these are examples of what we call trade barriers. Okay, any questions then about that before we move on to the next thing? All right, so we are now ready to move on to a discussion of global financial markets, right? So we've talked about net exports and the trade balance and how that represents the flows of goods and services across borders. Let me spend some time now talking about the flows of capital assets across borders in these kind of global financial markets, all right? Now look, US residents can participate in global financial markets almost as easily as they can participate in global product markets, right? Aaron, right? Let's say you drove to Atlanta to the IKEA store, okay? And you purchased a couple $1,000s worth of furniture. That transaction represents the flow of goods across borders from, let's see, IKEA is a Swedish company, right? From Sweden to the United States, okay? You could also, if you wanted to, buy, let's say, a stock or a bond issued by the IKEA Corporation. That doesn't represent a flow of goods and services across countries, but rather a flow of capital assets across countries, okay? So participants in the global markets can participate in product or financial markets in any country. The key concept that measures this flow of assets across countries rather than goods and services is what economists refer to as net capital outflow, or NCO for short. All right, now let me be clear about the definition. Net capital outflow is domestic residents' purchases of foreign assets minus foreigners' purchases of domestic assets. So it's the amount of capital assets that we acquire from the rest of the world, foreign stocks, foreign bonds, etc., minus the amount or the market value of capital assets that the rest of the world is acquiring from us. If you read the financial press or you see something about international economics in the news, they might refer to net capital outflow as net foreign investment. So a lot of times net exports is discussed in terms of the trade balance. Net capital outflow is discussed in terms of something called net foreign investment. Just know that these two things are the same. So I don't want anybody to be confused there. All right, let's work through a couple of examples to make sure we understand the concept. Let's suppose here that Aaron buys stock in the BMW Corporation, right? A German company. What is that going to do to US net capital outflow? Does it go up or does it go down? It's got to go up, right? Here we have an American who is acquiring a foreign asset. So US net capital outflow is going to rise. Germany's net capital outflow, on the other hand, would fall because you are a foreigner with regard to Germany, and that would be a foreign person acquiring an asset from Germany. What if a German resident buys a bond issued by, let's say, the Apple Corporation? Then US net capital outflow would fall, right? This is a foreign individual who's acquiring then a domestic asset, all right? So just like you guys understand what causes US net exports to go up or down through the export or the import margin, make sure you understand what net capital outflow is and how that can go up or go down. Either we are acquiring assets abroad or the rest of the world is purchasing some of our capital assets. Okay, these flows of capital assets from one country to the next generally take one of two possible forms. And I believed we talked about this a little bit earlier in the semester. This net foreign investment or net capital outflow can take the form of what's called a foreign direct investment or a foreign portfolio investment. You guys remember what this is? What is a foreign direct investment? That is when a domestic entity owns and operates a capital investment in a foreign country, right? So here's my silly little example here. Let's suppose that the McDonald's Corporation decides to open up a fast food restaurant in Moscow, Russia. This would be an example of a US foreign direct investment in the Russian economy. So US net capital outflow would rise as a result of that because the US is acquiring and operating physical capital assets in another country. It is a direct investment. The Mercedes assembly plant down the interstate here would be a German foreign direct investment in the US economy. That is a German entity owning and operating a capital investment here in the United States. What would happen to US net capital outflow in that case? It would go down, okay? Perfect. How does that differ from a foreign portfolio investment? This is perhaps the more common flow of capital across borders. A foreign portfolio investment is one in which domestic residents don't own and operate foreign capital, but rather their money or their resources are used to finance the purchase of foreign capital, right? In other words, we are supplying loanable funds to a foreign business, right? So if a US resident were to buy a stock or a bond issued by a Russian vodka maker, sorry, that's the only Russian product I can think of off the top of my head, then that would be a US foreign portfolio investment in the Russian economy, right? And therefore it would increase US net capital outflow. Okay, you guys have any questions then about that? Foreign direct versus foreign portfolio investment. Those are both two types of net capital outflows that you need to understand the difference between. All right, because net capital outflow tells us whether a country is on balance a borrower or a lender in global financial markets, this idea of net capital outflow can kind of be thought as the counterpart to the trade balance, right? What is the trade balance tells us whether a country is on balance a buyer or a seller in global product markets. Net capital outflow then can be thought of as a way of thinking about whether a country is on balance a borrower or a lender in these global financial markets, okay? So net capital outflow then measures this imbalance between the amount of foreign assets that we are acquiring and the amount of domestic assets that the rest of the world is acquiring from us. So there's really only a couple of possible states that net capital outflow can take, right? If our net capital outflow is a positive number, then what does that mean? That means we are purchasing over a given period of time, let's say a year, more foreign capital assets than the rest of the world is purchasing from us. We describe that situation then as a capital outflow from the US to the rest of the world. If we are purchasing or acquiring more assets abroad than the rest of the world is acquiring from us. If net capital outflow is a negative number, however, then we call that a capital inflow. That means the rest of the world is acquiring more capital domestically than we are from the rest of the world. All right. We've seen then how net exports and net capital outflow can then measure the imbalances that we view in these global product markets and global financial markets. All right, that's an important concept to understand. The trade balance tells us what the imbalances in global product markets are, whether or not we are buyers or sellers in product markets. Net capital outflow tells us whether we are borrowers or lenders in global financial markets. An important fact or result, maybe the most important result in this section of the course, is that for the economy as a whole, a country's net exports, that is its imbalance in trades of goods and services, must be exactly equal to its own net capital outflow. That is the amount of imbalances it observes in its flows of capital assets. Those two imbalances have to offset each other perfectly. All right, that's probably the central result of this chapter, is the idea that net exports or the trade balance has to equal net capital outflow. Right, so here we've already got an answer to one of those questions I asked you early on in the class today. How are these flows of goods and services across borders related to the flows of capital assets? Their market value has to be equal to one another at a macroeconomic aggregate level. NCO has to be equal to net exports. Now, by the way, I refer to this as an accounting identity because the variable on the right-hand side must equal the variable on the left-hand side by the way the variables are defined, right? In other words, every time a transaction takes place in an international market that causes one side to change, it must cause the other side of the equation to change by the same amount, all right? Now, let's work through a couple of just simple examples to try to provide some intuition on this result, because I think this is often a confusing concept to understand for principal students. Why is it that a country's flow of goods and services or their trade imbalance have to offset perfectly their imbalance in capital assets or net capital outflow? Well, let's go through a couple of cases here. Let's suppose that somebody from another country purchases a good in the United States or produced in the United States, okay? What happens to the right-hand side of this equation? What happens to US net exports? If a foreign citizen purchases a product made in the USA, US net exports are going to go up. That is an export from the USA to the rest of the world. All right. Now, according to this equation, our net capital outflow must increase as well. Now, what's the logic behind that? When a foreign individual purchases a good made in the US, how is that foreign person going to purchase that good in their own domestic market? They're going to use their own domestic currency, right? However, the US producer of that good is ultimately going to want to be paid in US dollars. So at some point along the way here, foreign currency has to be acquired by a US interest, all right? And so currency is just a particular type of asset, right? Currency or money is one type of asset. And so a US interest then is ultimately going to acquire foreign currency as a result of the transaction. And so at the aggregate level then, net capital outflow is also going to rise by whatever the market value of the transaction was in the first place. Okay? I guess let me give you a concrete example of this. Let's suppose that the Disney Pixar company sells the movie rights to the Toy Story franchise for like 100 million Australian dollars to an Australian movie theater chain. Okay, that represents 100 million Australian dollars worth of positive net exports for the United States. Okay, ultimately then, US interests have to acquire Australian currency. And so that increases our net capital outflow by the same amount. What if we flip this example on its head? What if a US citizen buys a foreign good? That's going to lower net exports, right? Because we're importing that product from abroad. And so it should also lower net capital outflow. Why does it do that? Well, we purchase the foreign product using US dollars. And so the foreign company in that case is then ultimately going to acquire US dollars, which is a US asset. And so US net capital outflow is going to fall dollar for dollar with the reduction in net exports. What happens to one side of the equation has to happen to the other. Our net exports, that is our trade balance, has to be balanced perfectly with our net capital outflow. Okay, let's take a minute now to see how these flows of goods and services and flows of capital assets relate to some of our other macroeconomic variables that we have introduced at earlier parts in the semester. All right, let me start by writing down the accounting identity for real GDP. So early on in the semester, we discussed how a country's gross domestic product is the sum of these four components: consumption spending, investment spending on capital, government purchases, and net exports. Again, this is an identity because every dollar that is used for a transaction in the US economy has to fall within one of these four categories. So they have to sum up to US gross domestic product. Now, how can we rearrange this equation to tell us something about these international flows? Well, first off, let's subtract both sides of the equation by C and G. So on the left-hand side, we have GDP minus consumption minus government spending is equal to investment plus net exports. Now, do you guys recognize this variable on the left-hand side? What do we call the resources left from our total income or output after we've spent on consumption and after government spending? What do we call that leftover amount? Y minus C minus G at a particular name when we discuss the financial market. I believe it was national savings, right? The resources left from our total economic income after households have spent on consumption and after the government has conducted their purchases is what we call national savings. If we rearrange this identity for GDP, we can see here that our national savings must equal investment plus net exports. Now, what did we just learn? We spent several minutes now talking about how a country's trade balance or net exports has to be equal to its capital asset imbalance given by net capital outflow. So this says that national savings should be equal to domestic investment plus net capital outflow. How does this equation generalize what we talked about earlier in the semester? When we discussed the financial system, hopefully you guys remember we made an assumption that we were operating in a closed economy, right? What happens in a closed economy? Net exports are zero, net capital outflow is zero. If net capital outflow is zero, then what do we have left here? Savings is equal to investment. Does that sound familiar? Right, that was our model of the loanable funds market. That every dollar that was invested or deposited into the financial system in the form of savings had to be matched dollar for dollar that was withdrawn from the financial system for the purposes of domestic investment, okay? That's not quite true. We see now that when we're talking about an economy that interacts with the rest of the world, where net exports and net capital outflow are not equal to zero, then savings no longer has to be equal to domestic investment, but rather investment plus net capital outflow. And let's think about the intuition here. What is this saying? Every dollar that we save, that we inject or deposit into the financial system in the form of savings, can be used to finance domestic investment, that is capital here in the United States, or it can be used to finance foreign investment, right? That is capital in other countries, okay? Now look, if our savings exceeds our own investment, then that means net capital outflow is going to be positive, right? And so those extra loanable funds we have are then going to go towards financing capital abroad, all right? What happens though if our savings is less than investment? Then we don't actually have enough domestic savings in order to finance all of the investment we need, and we need to make up the difference by basically importing additional loanable funds from the rest of the world. In other words, we have a capital inflow, so net capital outflow is going to be negative in that case. Okay, so this really, I'm hoping this doesn't change your understanding of what we talked about earlier in the semester too much with regards to the financial system. All right, when we discuss an open economy, there's just two sources of our investment, or two sources of savings, if you will. You don't just, savings doesn't necessarily have to be devoted strictly to domestic investment, but also foreign investment. Or the other way of looking at it, it's not just domestic savings that finances our own investment, but we also can have savings coming in from the rest of the world, a capital inflow. All right, so now you've got all these variables and equations floating around in your head. Let me take a step back from the math for a second and see what the actual US data says about savings and investment and net exports and net capital outflow. This figure shows US national savings, that's the red line, as well as investment, that's the blue line, from 1960 through 2019. And it also shows net capital outflow, which we know is what? It's the difference between savings and investment. So you take national savings and you subtract investment, and that gives us net capital outflow, which has to be equal to net exports, right? That is the trade balance. Sean? Uh-oh. Okay, so you don't see this in your notes. Is that true of everybody? Okay, so I screwed that up. Let me just keep talking here, and then what I'll do is I'll remember to load the correct slides up after class today, okay? All right, what do you notice happening before, let's say, the mid-70s? Savings and investment were fairly close to one another. And as a result, net capital outflow was around zero. And that agrees with what we saw in the previous graph, right? That the trade balance was close to zero, not a huge trade deficit or surplus. After the mid-70s, however, we started to see these trade deficits occur. That is, net capital outflow became negative. What I want you to look at here is that, or I should say, why it's helpful to decompose the trade deficit between savings and investment is it can help us understand why we are actually experiencing trade deficits. A lot of times you hear from politicians or pundits about this exploding US trade deficit and that it always has to be a bad thing. I'm here to tell you that that's not necessarily true. That I think it's a little bit more important to try to look at the underlying reasons why we're experiencing these trade deficits. And looking at a graph of our savings versus our investment can help shed some light on the mystery, okay? So let me just give you a couple of historical episodes here. Worries, concerns about the US trade deficit were pretty significant back in the mid 80s or so, right? That's when people in the US started really worrying about our growing trade deficit with the rest of the world. Now, why did that occur? Well, if you look at savings versus investment, it was because that savings was falling faster than investment was over the same period. So the reason why we were experiencing trade deficits in the 80s or growing trade deficits in the 80s is because our own national savings was kind of softening or weakening at that point. Compare that to like the early and mid 2000s, where we again see this kind of ballooning trade deficit with the rest of the world. Why did it happen then? Well, during this period, national savings was relatively flat, but what do you see happening to our domestic investment? It was rising significantly. So the more recent trade deficits have been the result of not weak savings, but rather heavy investment, okay? And that investment is being financed to a large extent by this savings that is coming in from the rest of the world. For better or worse, the United States is a very attractive place for the rest of the world to dump their own savings. And because of that, the US economy has experienced a negative net capital outflow, that capital is flowing into the country because the rest of the world wants to invest or save in our assets. They're less risky, the returns are higher, et cetera, et cetera. As a result, because net capital outflow is negative, that's really what's fueled these rising trade deficits over time. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. A trade deficit is not necessarily bad in the sense that a budget deficit is bad. A lot of times people hear the word deficit and they think that that's a economic negative. Well, not always, right? Some countries, if there are countries that are running trade surpluses, that means by definition, there have to be countries that are running trade deficits, right? That's always going to be the case. Sometimes it helps to look a little bit deeper at the reasons why an economy is experiencing a trade deficit. Okay, I'll try to remember to upload the correct slides into the student version after class today, so I apologize about that. All right, you guys have any questions then about that? Okay, let me talk briefly here about, or just introduce the concept of exchange rates, and then I'll stop for today, and we should have plenty of time to finish up everything in the next class. So far, we've discussed the flows of goods and services across borders and how we measure that by net exports or the trade balance. We've talked about the flows of assets across borders and how we measure that by net capital outflow. What I now want to do is clarify how we measure the prices of these international transactions, and we do that with exchange rates, okay? Now look, in economics, we have to distinguish between two types of exchange rates. Just like we talked about real versus nominal GDP and real interest rates versus nominal interest rates, and how inflation kind of drives a wedge between those real and nominal concepts, that also happens with regard to exchange rates. All right, so one of the key things that we're going to have to do here is understand the distinction between what a nominal exchange rate is versus a real exchange rate. Let me talk about nominal exchange rates first, because I think these are more straightforward. The nominal exchange rate is the rate at which one country's currency swaps for another country's currency, okay? So nominal exchange rates then are measured in units of currency, not in terms of real goods and services, all right? Now, the convention that we're going to adopt in this class is that exchange rates are always going to be expressed as units of foreign currency per unit of the domestic currency. You can define exchange rates the other way around. That is, units of domestic currency per unit of the foreign currency. And sometimes you'll see the data on exchange rates published that way online. But here, I want to try to standardize them by expressing the exchange rate as the number of units of a foreign currency per US dollar, okay? So let me give you a couple of quick examples here. When I was revising these slides, although I screwed up the graph on the previous slide, on the 6th of August of this year, here were some actual exchange rates. At the time, 1.34 Canadian dollars could be swapped per US dollar. So that's how we express the exchange rate between the Canadian dollar and the US dollar, is 1.34 Canadian dollars per US dollar. At the time, the euro was trading 0.83 euros per dollar. The Japanese yen was 103.42 yen per US dollar. And the Mexican peso was 22.25 pesos per US dollar. Again, you could invert each of these, right? 1 divided by 1.34, 1 divided by 0.83, et cetera, to represent the exchange rate as number of US dollars per unit of foreign currency. The information content is the same, but to keep it all standard in this class, it's going to be units of foreign currency per US dollar. There's lots of websites, by the way, you can go out and get exchange rate data in real time. The one that I use is called xe.com. And literally, you can choose between any two different countries in the entire world to see what the real-time spot exchange rate is. Sean? Why is it worth more than the dollar? Well, that's so when the euro was set up, I can't remember if it was they had it on parity with the dollar or not, but I'm going to talk about this in the next slide. These exchange rates can move around over time, but these numbers don't actually mean anything by themselves, right? I mean, think about it. If the U.S. government destroyed all of the currency and attached a zero to every dollar, every denomination that we had, then every price would simply go up by a factor of 10, right? And as a result, these exchange rates would change. So just because the euro is 0.83 per dollars doesn't really mean that the euro is quote unquote worth more. It's just the unit that the euro adopted at the time. And it's currently trading at about 0.83 per US dollar. And it usually is trading at something a little bit less. That's also true, by the way, of the British pound sterling, right? Usually the British pound, I think, trades at closer to 0.5 pounds per dollar, something like that. Yeah, so that leads me to this discussion of what economists refer to as, and this is where I'll stop after I talk about this, appreciations versus depreciations of the exchange rate, all right? So it's important to understand what the nominal exchange rate is, but one of the things we're going to try to accomplish in the next class is to develop a model that helps us understand why exchange rates move the way they do. That is, why they fluctuate over time. We call those movements in the exchange rates an appreciation or a depreciation. Now, what is an appreciation? This is an increase in the value of a currency as measured by the amount of the foreign currency it can buy. So when we talk about the dollar appreciating against foreign currencies, that means that the exchange rate as we've written it is going to rise, okay? That means a dollar can purchase more and more units of the foreign currency. So Sean, if the euro dollar exchange rate went from, what was it, 0.83 to let's say 1, then now a dollar is buying more units of European currency. That's a dollar that is strengthening or appreciating in currency markets. A depreciation, of course, is exactly the opposite. That is a decrease in the exchange rate as we've defined it, where the value of our currency measured by the amount of foreign currency it can buy goes down, or a weakening of the US dollar. All right, just some quick examples. So during 2007, the US dollar actually depreciated 9.5% against the euro. So it went down, from like 0.9 to 0.8 or something. At the same time, however, the US dollar appreciated 1.5% against the Korean won. So that's another point that I want to bring up, is that currency can depreciate against others and appreciate against other currencies at the same time. So just because the dollar is, let's say, strengthening against the South Korean won does not necessarily mean it's strengthening against the euro. It could be depreciating against the euro simultaneously. All right. So whether a currency is an exchange rate is rising or falling depends, of course, on which country you're talking about, the US versus the euro area or the US versus a different country. Let me ask you a couple of last questions here before I let you go. And I don't have this in the slide, but I think it's an important economic point. Who would be happy by an appreciation of the US currency? So think about the different members of our economy. If the US dollar was strengthening, who would be happy or who would be helped by that? And who would be hurt by that, you think? Sean? Why would that help them then? Okay, hold on. No, wait a minute. So if the dollar is strengthening, that means that if you are a foreign citizen and you want to buy products that are made in the USA, your currency is weakening relative to the dollar. So it takes you more money to buy US goods. So I would argue that US producers they don't like a strengthening currency because why? It makes it more difficult for them to sell their products in foreign markets. They become less competitive compared to foreign producers, right? So and you'll hear this a lot when you read these news stories about a strong dollar. A lot of the folks that are most vociferous against that are domestic producers who are trying to sell their products in foreign markets. But who would be helped or who would like an appreciation of the US dollar? What group of people think that would be a good thing? Matt? US consumers. When the dollar strengthens, it can buy more units of a foreign currency. That means foreign made products become cheaper for us. So we as consumers are helped by a strengthening dollar, whereas domestic firms are somewhat hurt by that. And exactly the opposite for a depreciation of the domestic currency. In that case, foreign products are more expensive for US consumers. So we don't like that. But a weakening dollar means that foreigners are now willing to buy US products more often. And so that helps domestic industries. Okay, you guys have any questions then about that? Here's kind of what's on the table for the next class then. We're going to spend the first 15 minutes or so of class discussing the real exchange rate, how that is different than the nominal exchange rate, and then we'll go through a couple of exercises on how to actually compute real exchange rates. And then for the rest of the class, what I want to do is develop a fairly straightforward supply and demand model of goods that are in these international global product markets to help us understand what causes or determines these movements in the nominal exchange rate over time. That theory is called purchasing power parity. And again, it's just based on simple supply and demand concepts. If I have any time left over, we'll work some more practice problems together, and then that will be it, okay?